This is your video lecture on the closing of the Western Frontier, Module 2. This is all about the time period of 1865 to 1891. When we're talking about this time period, remember there's other things going on in the United States, so this is the same time period as Reconstruction, so this is going alongside of Reconstruction, and we'll see some of the impact of Reconstruction and the New South in westward expansion as well. But when we're talking about this time period, I want you to envision something you learned about a few years ago, which was manifest destiny. Nothing quite embodies manifest destiny like this image by John Gast called American Progress. This shows Western expansion and the white Anglo-Saxon superiority and this American exceptionalism and all these ideals that are moving across the continent. So you can see Lady Columbia, who was bringing with her all of these new technologies like railroads and telegraphs and horse and buggy and all of these different people that are moving westward, farmers, and celebrating this idea of rugged individualism. All of these things are all associated with this time period and also kind of became ingrained into United States culture. One of the most, I would say, influential in the beginning ideas about Western expansion and the frontier came from a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. So in 1893, he presents this paper at the World's Fair explaining how the frontier was essential in the shaping of United States culture and how the West was more of a process rather than a place. He also highlighted the fact that the West was this meeting point between savagery and the savagery of Native Americans and the land versus American civilization and democracy. He said that this nation was shaped by the struggle on the Western frontier. And it celebrated this identity of freedom, of being self-reliant. So I think that when we're talking about telling the truth about history, this is sort of what historians more recently have begun to try to debunk was the significance of the frontier and how it became this symbol of American progress, which I think to some extent is true, but it's missing out on a huge, huge portion of the story. More recently, I read this quote from the Smithsonian, and I thought that this really embodied the difference between how we previously learned about the Western frontier and how we learn about it now. So it says, not too long ago, historians of the American West joined their artistic brethren in celebrating what we now think of as the Old West. For historians and artists, the winning of the West, so that settlement of savagery, was a glorious achievement that heralded the triumph of civilization over savagery. Indeed, by the conventional scholarly wisdom and orthodox artistic vision, the vanquishing of the Indians and the march of manifest destiny made America great and made Americans special. But in more recent decades, however, most historians and many Americans have rejected this perspective, dismantling cherished fables about the Old West and stripping away the romance from the history of westward ho. Newer studies have exhumed the human casualties and environmental costs of American expansion, offering little glory. These interpretations of how the West was lost have accented the savagery of American civilization. So I think that this goes along with what we were reading from W.E.B. Du Bois, telling the truth about history. So prior to this, it was much more celebrated, this Western frontier and the settlement of the frontier. But now we're beginning to tell the truth. The good, the bad, the human lives that were lost, the environmental costs of expansion. It's a much more complex story of the West. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we continue with this module. So our older view of the Western frontier is really celebrating this. Look at this guy in the front with his hunting garb on and the savages in the back. And it's a much more celebrated view of the West. But I want you to think of it more like an intersection. So the Western frontier becomes this intersection of all of these different groups interacting. And we need to make sure that we're highlighting all of the stories of these individuals so that we have a more accurate picture of what actually happens in the Western frontier. So when we're talking about the Western frontier, we're talking about all of these areas that are in the red and orange and kind of tan. So all of those were settled later on in the mid-century. So the green is all settled prior to 1870, and everything else was settled after the Civil War. So some important things that you need to know just for some historical context. In 1848, you remember learning about this all the way back to fourth grade, which is when the California gold rush begins. So we see a lot more Western movement there. Other important events that you're going to be reading about is the Homestead Act, which will encourage migration, giving land access to many individuals. The Transcontinental Railroad was expanded. In 1873, barbed wire was invented, which will change how cattle ranching happens. And then we have some Indian wars, so like the Battle of Little Bighorn, which you might remember. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Dawes Act. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. First, let's talk about African Americans moving westward. So this is after the Civil War, opportunity, and also a lot of discrimination in the South and in the North as well, which will encourage African Americans to go west. And they'll go to several different areas. And you can see on this graph, there are 3 different time periods that you see expansion. And this is going to be one of the first major movements of African Americans in American history. So you can see that they're going to relocate to western areas, and this will be the first of, again, several major movements of African Americans prompted by economic opportunity and also discrimination. We had a great majority that are moving to Kansas, and those are called exodusters. So they're given the opportunity to farm some land and move to Kansas. And others will join the Buffalo Soldiers, which is a army group who are going to participate in a lot of the Indian Wars in the mid-19th century. So you're going to be reading about the Buffalo Soldiers as well. And remember, they're escaping Jim Crow, they're escaping what's happening in South and Northern areas and establishing new opportunities on the Western frontier. So that's the first sort of intersection. We also have a huge group that's coming to the West, and this is going to start around the gold rush. And many Chinese are going to move to the West as well. It becomes a meeting place for them. They're going to initially work in many of the mines, and then after the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is passed in 1882, and this is prompted by the Knights of Labor, a major labor movement, they're going to be greatly limited on the amount of Chinese and Asians who are going to be immigrating to the United States. So this is prompted by racism, job competition, but the big thing that's going to result from this is the development of Chinese industries. And we'll also see one of the first developments on the West of these ethnic neighborhoods and these ethnic areas. So I think that's an important point that you'll read about in your textbook as well. We also have farmers that are going to be, and settlers who are going to be moving west. They're going to build these sod homes. So they're soddies. Looks like a lovely place to live. They were built of basically mud, very simplistic. They're going to be living really far away from one another. So we've got families who are going to be living in these tiny houses miles and miles away from other families, which can cause some isolation, but it also causes a lot of strength to be born within a lot of the people who do survive. And I'm going to be honest, there's not very many who survive living on the Western frontier in these soddies. So women will play an important role in this. They will be shown, or they'll show how strong they are and how willing they are to, do some really incredible things that they didn't have to do when they lived in other areas. So they're going to be given a lot of opportunities on the Western frontier that they don't necessarily get in the North. The next group that we're going to be looking at is the Native Americans, and this is a very, very important part of this story. So we have Native Americans who are in different areas all across the United States, and they've been there for centuries. But when the United States is going to be moving westward, so a lot of these settlers and settlers from other countries are moving westward as well, the Native Americans will be there, and they're not necessarily willing to give up their location that they're at. They're not necessarily willing to conform to American society and all of the different expectations of that. So there's going to be a lot of confrontation over Native Americans on this land. So it's going to result in a loss of land, a loss of tradition, and there's going to be a lot of conflicts with the U.S. government. And this will lead to the instating the reservation policies. So having Native Americans live in certain areas, usually in very undesirable areas, because the land that they formerly occupied usually had something good that the U.S. government wanted. So moving to reservations, which we still use today, and then also encouraging the assimilation of Native Americans to more, as they would consider, civilized American society. So a proponent of that is Helen Hunt Jackson, who's in this photo. So she writes a very influential book, A Century of Dishonor, explaining how the U.S. government has played a detrimental role in Native Americans. But it's also going to encourage this assimilationist policy. So as you can see in this photo, this is the Carlisle School. These are Native Americans who have been given American and Western clothing and haircuts, and they encourage them to change their names or force them to change their names and accept Christianity. So we see the dwindling of Native American culture. And this will lead to the Dawes Act of 1887, which is when the U.S. government will break up Native American land holdings to 160 acres. Later on, they're going to take those lands from Native Americans and sell them to white settlers. So this is essentially dismantling Native American cultures in many areas, especially areas like in the Dakotas. In the textbook, you're going to read about the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. So this is in response to Native Americans who are fighting back, and they are going to be very closely adhering to their culture. And one of the things that they're going to be really adhering to is the ghost dance movement. So this is when the Native Americans, and this is in the Dakotas, the United States government is going to be infringing on their land, their areas, and they really, the Sioux are going to be really adhering to their culture. So one of the things that they do is they are going to be doing this ghost dance. So it is several days where they're going to go to certain areas. And this one was by a river. So a group of Native Americans are going to go there and try to summon the spirits of their family members who had passed away. And ultimately, the U.S. government is going to try to not allow them to do this. And ultimately what happens is a fight breaks out between the U.S. soldiers and the Native Americans. There's several stories about how it all started, but from the one I've heard most frequently is there's a Native American who is deaf and he doesn't hear the instructions from the U.S. government official, and the U.S. government official, his gun goes off and it starts this huge battle between the U.S. soldiers and Native Americans. So ultimately what happens is we have just bloodshed that is spilt all over this area. And if you would like to see more information about that, there's a really wonderful story. It's from a book, but then they turned it into an HBO movie, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and I think that you'll find it to be very eye-opening, and also will inform you about really the assimilationist policies and the dishonor that the U.S. government and U.S. society has done to Native Americans over centuries. So those are the big things that I want you to make sure that you are highlighting as you're reading the textbook. Remember, the West is this intersection of all of these different entities, and it's important that you understand that all of them are going to be playing an important role in shaping what the West looks like and the story of the West. So I hope that you enjoyed this quick little intro into the Western frontier. There's so much more that we can be learning about, but unfortunately this is a pretty quick unit in our study. You will be writing an essay. And for those of you who listen to the rest or this entirety, I'll give you a quick preview as to what it is. So your essay, one of your essay choices is going to be about the land of opportunity in the West. And was the West this place of opportunity for all? So in your essay, you would highlight all of the things I just said in this lecture and make sure that you are adding evidence about each one of those subgroups at this intersection of the West. So there's your little preview as to what you would be writing about. All right, thanks so much.